In the quaint Cotswolds village of Chipping Norton, a deadly secret lurks beneath the charm of Willoughby Hall. When Colonel Ashby, a man obsessed with crisp ginger biscuits, collapses at a grand gathering, poisoned by a single bite, Miss Jane Marple's keen eye unravels a web of ambition, debt, and hidden love. From the resentful housekeeper to the calculating niece, the charming antiques dealer to the distracted doctor, everyone is a suspect. With cyanide in the biscuit and motives in every heart, can Miss Marple uncover the truth before the killer strikes again? Dive into a classic Agatha Christie-style mystery, where a simple biscuit holds the key to murder. Chapter 1. The Curious Incident at Willoughby Hall. The late autumn sun cast a golden haze over Chipping Norton, a village tucked in the gentle folds of the Cotswolds, where the ancient stone houses seemed to doze under their thatched roofs. Willoughby Hall, a handsome Georgian manor draped in ivy, stood at the edge of the village, its tall windows reflecting the last rays of daylight. It was the home of Colonel Reginald Ashby, a widower of military bearing, whose life revolved around his collection of rare manuscripts and an almost obsessive devotion to ginger biscuits, not too sweet and baked to his exacting standards. Tonight, the hall was alive with the hum of a small gathering, arranged to showcase the Colonel's latest acquisition, a medieval manuscript, its illuminated pages a treasure few in the village could fully appreciate. Miss Jane Marple, visiting her dear friend Mrs. Clara Bantry, had been persuaded to attend the event. She sat now in a high-backed chair near the drawing-room's marble fireplace, her knitting needles moving with quiet precision, her eyes taking in the scene with the mild curiosity of one accustomed to noticing what others overlooked. The room was warm, the fire casting flickering shadows on the polished oak paneling, and a silver tray of ginger biscuits made its rounds, their sharp, spicy scent mingling with the perfume of beeswax and old roses. The guests were a small but varied lot. Mrs. Bantry, her cheeks flushed with excitement, was deep in conversation with Mrs. Lydia Finch, the Colonel's housekeeper, whose pinched expression suggested she found such gatherings more chore than pleasure. Dr. Henry Lloyd, the young village physician, stood by the window, his gaze distant, as though his thoughts were elsewhere. Miss Eleanor Price, the Colonel's niece, moved about with a proprietary air, her sharp features softened by a calculated smile. Mr. Victor Crane, an antiques dealer with sleek hair and a too-easy charm, leaned against the mantel, his eyes darting from guest to guest. Lastly, there was Mr. Thomas Reed, the Colonel's solicitor, a slight man with a habit of adjusting his spectacles when nervous, which he did frequently tonight. Colonel Ashby himself presided over the gathering, with the air of a general reviewing his troops. His ruddy face glowed with pride as he gestured toward the manuscript, displayed under glass on a mahogany table. "A 13th-century Psalter," he boomed, his voice carrying the authority of the parade ground. "Worth every penny, though I shan't bore you with the cost," he chuckled, reaching for a biscuit from the tray Mrs. Finch had just set down. He selected one with care, inspecting it for the crisp edges he prized, then took a hearty bite. Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment as she watched him. She had noted his habit earlier, his insistence on choosing the most perfectly baked biscuit, a quirk well known to those around him. It was, she thought, the sort of detail that might matter. The conversation turned to village matters, repairs to the church roof, the upcoming harvest festival, when a sudden change came over the Colonel. His hand flew to his throat, his eyes widened in alarm, and a strangled gasp escaped his lips. The biscuit fell from his fingers, crumbling on the Persian rug. Before anyone could react, he staggered and collapsed, his heavy frame striking the floor with a thud that silenced the room. Dr. Lloyd was at his side in an instant, loosening the Colonel's collar and checking for a pulse. "He's gone," he said quietly, his voice tight with shock. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the guests. Mrs. Bantry clutched Miss Marple's arm, her eyes wide. "Oh, Jane, what's happened?" Miss Marple's gaze, lingered on the scattered crumbs of the biscuit, then moved to the tray, where the remaining biscuits sat innocently. Her mind, sharp as the needles in her lap, turned over the possibilities. A heart attack, perhaps, but the Colonel's robust health was well known. An accident? Unlikely. Poison, she thought, was far more probable, and the biscuit was the most obvious vehicle. Inspector Grayson arrived within the hour, a solid, unhurried man with a notebook and a knack for asking the right questions. He surveyed the room, his eyes lingering on the tray of biscuits, now cordoned off by a constable. "We'll need to test everything," he said. "No one leaves until we've spoken." As the guests were questioned, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting resumed, her thoughts racing. The Colonel's death was no accident, she was certain. Someone in this room had known his habits, had known which biscuit he would choose. And that someone, she reflected, had been very clever indeed. Chapter 2. The Bitter Taste of Suspicion. The morning after Colonel Ashby's death dawned crisp and cold over Chipping Norton, the village stirring uneasily under a veil of frost. The news of the tragedy at Willoughby Hall had spread like wildfire, whispered over garden fences, and debated in the cozy confines of the Black Swan Inn. By 10 o'clock, the village was alive with speculation, each theory more lurid than the last. In Mrs. Clara Bantry's cottage, a stone's throw from the village green, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, a cup of tea balanced delicately in her hands, her knitting folded neatly in her lap. The fire crackled in the grate, but the warmth did little to dispel the chill of the previous night's events. Mrs. Bantry, never one to let a crisis pass without commentary, bustled in with a tray of scones, her face alight with the thrill of gossip. "Jane, it's simply dreadful," she began, setting the tray down with a clatter. "They're saying it was poison cyanide, no less, in one of those wretched ginger biscuits. Can you imagine? And poor Reginald, of all people, who never harmed a soul well, not unless you count his tempers over those manuscripts of his." Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and clear despite her gentle demeanor, met her friend's. "Cyanide," she murmured, her voice soft but precise. "A very deliberate choice. Quick, effective, and dreadfully final. But what interests me, Clara, is how the poison found its way into just one biscuit. The Colonel was particular, wasn't he? Always choosing the crispest one." Mrs. Bantry nodded vigorously, her curls bobbing. "Oh, yes. Everyone knew it. He'd inspect the tray like a general at muster, picking out the one with the perfect snap. Lydia Finch used to grumble about it. You know, she'd bake dozens to get them just right." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over the details of the previous evening. The drawing-room at Willoughby Hall had been crowded with opportunity. The silver tray of biscuits had passed from hand to hand, Mrs. Finch setting it down, Eleanor rearranging it, Victor Crane offering it to guests, even Mr. Reed nudging it aside to make room for his papers. Any one of them could have slipped a poisoned biscuit onto the tray, knowing the Colonel's habit would guide his choice. But who had the motive to risk such a brazen act? Inspector Grayson, a man whose methodical nature reminded Miss Marple of a particularly thorough gardener, had arrived at the cottage earlier to share the preliminary findings. The police laboratory had confirmed cyanide in the remnants of the Colonel's biscuit, a single deadly dose cunningly concealed. The other biscuits were untainted, ruling out a random act. Someone knew exactly what they were doing, Grayson had said, his brow furrowed. "We're questioning everyone who was in the room, but it's a devil of a job to pin down who handled what." Miss Marple had nodded, her expression one of polite interest, though her thoughts were already racing ahead. The key, she felt, lay not in the act itself, but in the knowledge behind it. The murderer had relied on the Colonel's predictable taste, a detail known to those closest to him. Her task now was to unravel the web of relationships in that room, to find the thread that led to murder. Mrs. Bantry, settling into an armchair with a scone, was eager to assist. "They're saying Eleanor Price stands to inherit the lot," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Willoughby Hall, the manuscripts, the investments, everything. She's a cold fish, that one. Always thought she was waiting for the Colonel to pop off so she could take over. And then there's Victor Crane. Did you know he owed Reginald money? Something about a deal gone sour over that manuscript. The village is buzzing about it. Miss Marple's needles, had they been in her hands, would have clicked softly. Money, she said, is so often at the root of these things. But there's also resentment, Clara. Mrs. Finch, for instance. Didn't you mention she'd quarreled with the Colonel?" "Oh, yes." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "Last week, at the grocer's, I overheard her complaining to Mrs. Tuttle. Said the Colonel was stingy, always docking her wages for the smallest mistakes. She was furious, Jane, and she baked those biscuits herself, didn't she?" "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her tone thoughtful. "But baking them doesn't mean poisoning them. The tray was in the kitchen for some time before the party, and then it passed through so many hands. Opportunity, Clara, is not the same as intent." Mrs. Bantry frowned, buttering her scone with unnecessary force. "Well, what about Dr. Lloyd? He was right there when it happened, and he couldn't save the Colonel. Doesn't that seem odd? A doctor, of all people." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. "Doctors are not magicians, my dear. Cyanide works swiftly, and even the best physician might be powerless. Still, I did notice Dr. Lloyd seemed preoccupied last night. Not quite himself." She set her teacup down, her mind drifting back to the drawing room. Dr. Lloyd had been standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression distant, until the Colonel's collapse had jolted him into action. Had he been nervous? Guilty? Or merely lost in some private worry? And then there was Mr. Reed, the solicitor, whose nervous tics had been more pronounced than usual. He had hovered near the biscuit tray, adjusting his spectacles as though they might shield him from scrutiny. The village clock struck 11, and Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "I think," she said, "I shall take a walk to Willoughby Hall. A little fresh air often clarifies the mind." Mrs. Bantry, accustomed to her friend's quiet resolve, nodded. "You'll find something, Jane. You always do." The path to Willoughby Hall wound through frost-dusted hedgerows, the air sharp with the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Miss Marple walked slowly, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel, her thoughts as orderly as the stitches in her knitting. The hall loomed ahead, its windows dark under the overcast sky, a house now touched by death. She was admitted by a subdued maid, who led her to the drawing-room, where the police had left behind a faint air of disruption chair slightly askew, the manuscript still under its glass case, the biscuit tray gone for analysis. Mrs. Finch was in the kitchen, kneading dough with a vigor that suggested suppressed anger. Miss Marple, with her knack for putting people at ease, complimented the housekeeper's roses, visible through the window, before turning the conversation to the previous night. "Such a dreadful shock," she said, her voice gentle. "You must have worked so hard on those biscuits. The Colonel was so particular, wasn't he?" Mrs. Finch's hand stilled, her eyes narrowing. "He was that," she said. "Always wanting them just so ginger, not too sweet, crisp as a cracker. I baked them fresh that afternoon, left them on the counter to cool. Anyone could have got at them." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. "And did anyone come into the kitchen before the party?" The housekeeper hesitated, her fingers tightening on the dough. "Mr. Crane was there, asking for water. Said he was parched. And Miss Eleanor came in, fussing about the table settings. Didn't like the way I'd arranged the napkins. That's all I saw." Miss Marple thanked her and moved on, her mind cataloguing the details. Crane, with his quick hands and questionable debts. Eleanor, with her inheritance and sharp tongue. Both had been near the biscuits. Both had reason to wish the Colonel gone. But there was something else, a niggling detail from the party, a glance, a gesture that eluded her. She would need to observe them all again, to watch for the telltale signs of guilt that no one, however clever, could fully conceal. As she left the hall, the wind carried the faint toll of the church bell, a reminder of time's relentless march. Miss Marple pulled her shawl closer, her thoughts as clear and sharp as the frost underfoot. The murderer, she knew, had counted on the Colonel's love for his favorite biscuit, but they had not counted on her. Chapter 3. The Housekeeper's Tale. The afternoon sun struggled through a veil of clouds, casting a muted glow over Chipping Norton's cobbled lanes. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, made her way back from Willoughby Hall, her steps measured but purposeful. The conversation with Mrs. Finch lingered in her mind, each word sifted like flour through a sieve. The housekeeper's defensiveness, her fleeting hesitation when asked about the kitchen, suggested more than mere irritation at the Colonel's exacting standards. Miss Marple knew that resentment, left to simmer, could curdle into something far darker. Yet she also knew that accusations without evidence were as flimsy as poorly baked pastry. Back at Mrs. Bantry's cottage, the fire had been stoked, and the air was thick with the scent of fresh tea. Mrs. Bantry, ever eager for news, pounced as Miss Marple entered. "Well, Jane? Did Lydia Finch confess to poisoning the biscuits?" "I wouldn't put it past her. She's got that pinched look, like someone who's been crossed one too many times." Miss Marple smiled faintly, settling into her usual chair by the window. "Confess? No, Clara." Mrs. Finch was guarded, but that's to be expected. She's a woman who feels her position keenly, years of service, yet never quite appreciated. But whether that resentment led to murder, I'm not yet certain. She recounted the housekeeper's words. The biscuits baked fresh, left to cool in the kitchen, and the presence of Victor Crane and Eleanor Price before the party. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. Crane and Eleanor, both in the kitchen? That's suspicious, Jane. Either one could have slipped something onto the tray. Indeed, Miss Marple said, her fingers smoothing the edge of her shawl. But suspicion is not proof. We must consider why they were there, and what they stood to gain. Mrs. Finch, too, had opportunity, but opportunity alone is a blunt instrument. Determined to probe further, Miss Marple decided to revisit Willoughby Hall. The housekeeper, she felt, was a key thread in this tangled skein, and another conversation might reveal more. She arrived at the hall just as the clock struck 3, the house quieter now, its grandeur muted by the shadow of death. The maid, pale and subdued, admitted her, and Miss Marple found Mrs. Finch in the pantry, inventorying jars of preserves with a meticulousness that bordered on obsession. "Mrs. Finch," Miss Marple began, her voice soft as a summer breeze, "I do hope I'm not interrupting. I was just admiring your roses again, so splendid for this time of year. It must take such care to keep them blooming." The housekeeper's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained wary. "They're a lot of work, Miss Marple, but I manage. Not much else to do when you're tied to a place like this." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze wandering to the neatly labeled jars. "You manage so much here, don't you? The Colonel must have relied on you greatly, especially for those biscuits he loved so well." Mrs. Finch's hands paused, a jar of plum jam suspended in midair. "He did," she said curtly. "Fussy as anything, he was. Had to be ginger biscuits, baked to a snap, not a crumb out of place. I'd spend hours getting them right, and he'd still find fault sometimes." There was a bitterness in her tone, faint but unmistakable. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle curiosity. That must have been trying. And on the night of the party, with so much to prepare, it can't have been easy to have others in your kitchen. "You mentioned Mr. Crane and Miss Eleanor. Did they linger long?" Mrs. Finch set the jar down with a small thud. "Not long. Mr. Crane came in, all smiles, asking for a glass of water. Said he'd been traveling and was parched. I gave him one and sent him on his way. Miss Eleanor was fussing about the table, moving things about, saying the napkins weren't right. She's always poking her nose in, that one. Did they touch the biscuits? Miss Marple asked, her tone as mild as if she were inquiring about the weather. Mrs. Finch's eyes narrowed. I didn't see them touch anything. The tray was on the counter, covered with a cloth. I took it to the drawing-room myself. But she hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. I did step out for a moment to fetch more napkins from the linen closet. Couldn't have been more than a minute or two. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face betrayed nothing. A minute or two ample time for a quick hand to tamper with the tray. And when you returned, was anyone still there? She asked. No, Mrs. Finch said quickly. The kitchen was empty. I took the tray straight to the drawing-room and set it out. That's all I know. Miss Marple thanked her, her mind already turning over this new piece of the puzzle. The housekeeper's brief absence was a window of opportunity, one that Crane or Eleanor, or someone else entirely, might have seized. But Mrs. Finch's demeanor troubled her. The woman's hands had trembled slightly as she spoke, and her eyes had darted to the side, as though avoiding some unspoken truth. Was it guilt, fear, or simply the strain of being questioned? As Miss Marple left the pantry, she paused in the hallway, her gaze falling on a small photograph on the wall, a younger Mrs. Finch standing beside a man in a soldier's uniform. The colonel, perhaps in his younger days? Or someone else? She made a mental note to inquire discreetly. In a village like Chipping Norton, old loyalties and grudges often ran deeper than the surface suggested. Outside, the air was sharp, and the first stars were beginning to pierce the twilight sky. Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts as intricate as the lace she knitted. Mrs. Finch's resentment was clear, but was it motive enough for murder? Or had she merely been a convenient pawn, her absence from the kitchen exploited by another? Crane's presence in the kitchen was curious as excuse of thirst plausible but thin. And Eleanor, with her proprietary airs, had both motive and opportunity, her inheritance a glittering prize. Miss Marple's mind drifted to her own village, where she had seen how small slights could fester into great wrongs. Mrs. Finch reminded her of a housemaid she'd known years ago, a woman who'd borne her employer's demands with quiet endurance until a single betrayal had tipped her into desperation. Could Mrs. Finch have reached such a point? Or was she, like so many in this affair, hiding something less sinister but equally revealing? As she neared Mrs. Bantry's cottage, Miss Marple resolved to speak with Victor Crane next. His charm, she suspected, was a polished veneer, and beneath it might lie the truth about that fatal biscuit. The murderer, she thought, had been clever, but cleverness often left traces. A word, a glance, a moment's hesitation that could unravel even the most carefully laid plan. Chapter 4. The Dealer's Secret. The evening shadows lengthened across Chipping Norton, painting the village in hues of violet and gray as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the Black Swan Inn. The pub, with its low-beamed ceiling and the warm glow of lanterns, was a hub of village life, where tongues loosened over pints of ale and secrets sometimes slipped into the open. Miss Marple, her small figure wrapped in a woolen shawl, entered unobtrusively, her presence as unremarkable as a sparrow in a hedgerow. She had learned from Mrs. Bantry that Victor Crane, the antiques dealer, was often found at the Black Swan in the evenings, nursing a drink and charming anyone who cared to listen. Tonight, she intended to observe him closely, for his glib manner at Willoughby Hall had struck her as a mask that might conceal darker truths. The inn was lively, filled with the murmur of voices and the clink of glasses. Miss Marple settled at a small table near the fire, her knitting bag at her side, her eyes scanning the room with the quiet alertness of one accustomed to seeing more than was shown. Victor Crane was at the bar, his sleek dark hair catching the lamplight, his tailored coat a touch too fine for a village pub. He was laughing with the innkeeper, his voice smooth as polished mahogany, but Miss Marple noted the quick flick of his eyes, as if he were always watching for an opportunity or a threat. She ordered a glass of elderflower cordial, her demeanor so mild that the other patrons scarcely noticed her. Yet her mind was sharp, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle that was Colonel Ashby's death. Crane's presence in the kitchen before the fatal party, his claim of seeking water, had lingered in her thoughts. It was a plausible excuse, but too convenient, like a line rehearsed for an audience. And then there was the matter of his dealings with the Colonel Adet, Mrs. Bantry had said, over the manuscript that had been the centerpiece of the gathering. Money, Miss Marple knew, could twist even the most charming soul into something desperate. Approaching the bar under the pretense of inquiring about the inn's history, Miss Marple caught Crane's attention. "Mr. Crane," she said, her voice gentle but clear, "I couldn't help but admire your knowledge of antiques at Willoughby Hall. That manuscript the Colonel showed us was quite remarkable. You must have gone to great lengths to acquire it for him." Crane turned, his smile quick and practiced, though his eyes held a flicker of wariness. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" "Yes, the Psalter was a fine de rare piece, worth every bit of trouble." The Colonel was delighted, though he drove a hard bargain. His tone was light, but there was an edge to it, like a blade hidden in velvet. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of innocent curiosity. "It must be difficult, dealing with such particular clients. I imagine the Colonel's standards extended beyond his biscuits to his business dealings." Crane's smile tightened, and he took a sip of his whiskey, his fingers drumming lightly on the glass. "He was particular, yes, wanted everything on his terms. I delivered the manuscript, but he hadn't paid me yet. Said he'd settle after the party." "A delay, nothing more." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft but unyielding. "And during the party, you were so helpful, passing the biscuit tray. I noticed you have such quick hands, quite deft, really. Almost like a conjurer." For a moment, Crane's composure faltered, his fingers stilling on the glass. "A conjurer?" he said, forcing a laugh. "Hardly. I was just being polite, helping Mrs. Finch. Everyone handled that tray at some point. Why single me out?" "Oh, I don't," Miss Marple said, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "It's just that I find habits so revealing. The Colonel's love for those crisp biscuits, for instance, everyone seemed to know about it. Such a small thing, yet so significant." Crane's eyes narrowed slightly, but he recovered quickly, leaning back with an easy grin. "You're a sharp one, Miss Marple, but I'm just a dealer, not a poisoner. I had no reason to harm the Colonel. He owed me money, not the other way around." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking faintly in her bag as she thanked him and returned to her table. She had seen enough, the momentary crack in his charm, the way his hand had tightened on the glass when she mentioned the biscuits. Crane was a man who thrived on control, and the Colonel's unpaid debt might have pushed him to a reckless act. His quick hands, she thought, could have slipped a poisoned biscuit onto the tray in the brief moment Mrs. Finch had left the kitchen unattended. As she sipped her cordial, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to her own village, where she had once known a shopkeeper with a similar charm, a man who smiled while cheating his customers, until one day his schemes caught up with him. Crane, she suspected, was cut from similar cloth, his polish a veneer over something sharper. But suspicion was not enough. She needed evidence, a thread to tie him to the crime. The inn grew noisier, but Miss Marple remained a quiet island amidst the chatter, her mind weaving through the possibilities. Crane's debt gave him motive, and his presence in the kitchen gave him opportunity. Yet others had been near the tray: Eleanor, with her inheritance; Mrs. Finch, with her grievances; even Mr. Reed, whose nervous tics suggested more than professional anxiety. And Dr. Lloyd, so distracted that night, what had preoccupied him? Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the night pressed close, the stars hidden by clouds. The murderer, she thought, had relied on the Colonel's predictable habit, but they had also relied on the chaos of the party, the tray passing from hand to hand. It was a bold plan, but boldness often bred mistakes. A glance, a word, a moment's hesitation, something would betray them. She rose, leaving a coin for her cordial, and stepped into the cool night air. The village was quiet now, the lights of the Black Swan glowing behind her. Tomorrow, she decided, she would speak with Eleanor Price. The niece's cool demeanor and her stake in the Colonel's fortune made her a figure of interest, and Miss Marple had a knack for coaxing truths from even the most guarded hearts. As she walked toward Mrs. Bantry's cottage, her thoughts were as precise as the stitches in her knitting, each one building toward the pattern that would reveal the killer. Chapter 5. The Niece's Ambition. The morning mist clung to Chipping Norton's lanes, softening the edges of the stone cottages and lending Willoughby Hall an air of quiet melancholy. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl drawn tightly against the damp, made her way to the hall once more, her steps as deliberate as the thoughts turning in her mind. The conversation with Victor Crane had left her with a sharper sense of the man's unease, his charm a thin veil over something calculating. Yet her instincts told her that Eleanor Price, the Colonel's niece, held a key to the puzzle. A woman with an inheritance at stake and a reputation for cool pragmatism was not to be overlooked, especially when her hands had been near the fatal tray. Eleanor had agreed to meet Miss Marple in the hall's morning room, a space of faded elegance with chintz curtains and a view of the frost-tipped gardens. As Miss Marple entered, she found Eleanor seated at a small table, a teapot and 2 cups before her posture as composed as a portrait. She was a striking woman in her early 30s, her dark hair swept back, her gray eyes assessing. Yet there was a hardness in her features, a set to her jaw that suggested a will not easily bent. "Miss Marple," Eleanor said, her voice smooth but measured, "I'm surprised you've taken such an interest in my uncle's death. I'd have thought you'd leave it to the police." She poured tea with a steady hand, offering a cup to her guest. Miss Marple accepted the tea, her expression one of gentle deference. "Oh, I'm merely an observer, Miss Price. But I find human nature so fascinating, don't you? And your uncle's passing was so sudden, so tragic. It's natural to wonder how such a thing could happen." Eleanor's lips curved in a faint, humorless smile. Natural, perhaps, but uncomfortable. The police seemed convinced it was the biscuit. Cyanide, they say. It's absurd to think anyone here would do such a thing. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. Absurd, and yet it happened. The Colonel's love for those ginger biscuits was well known, wasn't it? I noticed you were quite particular about the table that evening, arranging the tray just so. You must have known how much he valued a crisp biscuit. Eleanor's fingers tightened briefly on her cup, a flicker of tension that Miss Marple noted. "Uncle Reginald was impossible about those biscuits," she said, her tone clipped. "Always inspecting them, always complaining if they weren't perfect. Yes, I moved the tray to make the table look presentable. I like things orderly. Is that a crime?" "Not at all," Miss Marple said, her voice as soft as the morning light. "Order is so comforting, isn't it? But it does make one wonder. With so many hands near that tray, it's curious that only one biscuit was poisoned, and that it found its way to your uncle." Eleanor's gaze hardened, though her smile remained. "You're suggesting I had something to do with it? I stand to inherit. Yes, but I didn't need to kill him. He was old, Miss Marple. I could have waited a few years. Why risk everything?" Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild curiosity. Why, indeed? Yet impatience can be such a human failing, and you were in the kitchen before the party, were you not? Mrs. Finch mentioned you were there, adjusting the napkins. Eleanor set her cup down with a faint clink. "I was in the kitchen for a moment. Yes. The napkins were a mess, and I wanted the table to look right for Uncle's guests. I didn't touch the biscuits. Mrs. Finch was hovering like a hawk. She'd have seen if I had." Miss Marple nodded, her needles resting quietly in her bag, though her mind was stitching together the details. Eleanor's composure was admirable, but there was a brittleness to it, like porcelain that might crack under pressure. Her motive was clear Willoughby Hall, and its wealth were a prize worth coveting. Her opportunity, too, was undeniable. She had been in the kitchen during that critical moment when Mrs. Finch stepped away. Yet her denial was firm, and Miss Marple knew that truth often lay in the smallest discrepancies. As they spoke, Miss Marple's gaze wandered to a photograph on the mantel, a younger Eleanor standing beside the Colonel at some formal event, her smile tight, his hand resting heavily on her shoulder. It spoke of a relationship more dutiful than warm, and Miss Marple wondered what resentments might have simmered beneath Eleanor's polished exterior. "You must have been close to your uncle," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational. "Living here, helping with the household. It can't have been easy, with his particular ways." Eleanor's eyes flickered, a shadow crossing her face. "Close? Hardly. He treated me like a secretary, always issuing orders. I stayed because it was expected, and because this house. It's my heritage, but I earned my place here, Miss Marple. I didn't need to poison him to claim it." Miss Marple murmured sympathetically, her mind drifting to a young woman she'd known in her own village, who had nursed a quiet ambition beneath a dutiful facade until a single act of defiance had changed everything. Eleanor, she thought, was not so different, capable, calculating, and perhaps impatient. But was she a murderer? As she rose to leave, Miss Marple paused at the door. "One last thing, Miss Price. Did you notice anyone else near the Biscuits that evening? Mr. Crane, perhaps, or Dr. Lloyd?" Eleanor hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. Crane was hovering, as he always does, and Dr. Lloyd was distracted, I suppose. Kept looking out the window, as if he expected someone. But I was too busy to pay much attention. Miss Marple thanked her and stepped into the chilly hall, her thoughts as intricate as the lace she knitted. Eleanor's composure was a shield, but her hesitation when mentioning Dr. Lloyd was a crack in that armor. There was something there, a connection Miss Marple could not yet define. And Dr. Lloyd's distraction, noted by others as well, was a thread she must follow. As she walked back to Mrs. Bantry's cottage, the mist curling around her like a whisper, Miss Marple considered the web of motives and opportunities. Eleanor's inheritance gave her reason, and her presence in the kitchen gave her means. Yet the same could be said of Crane, or even Mrs. Finch. The key, she felt, lay in the relationships between them, loyalties, grudges, hidden alliances. Someone had known the Colonel's habits intimately, and someone had used that knowledge with deadly precision. Miss Marple's steps quickened, her mind as sharp as the frost beneath her feet. The next piece of the puzzle, she decided, lay with Dr. Lloyd. Chapter 6. The Doctor's Distraction. The late afternoon light filtered through the bare branches of Chipping Norton's oaks, casting dappled shadows on the path as Miss Jane Marple walked toward the village surgery. The air was sharp with the promise of early winter, and her sensible shoes crunched softly on the fallen leaves. Her conversation with Eleanor Price had left her with a clearer picture of the niece's steely ambition, but it was Dr. Henry Lloyd's behavior at the fatal party that now occupied her thoughts. His distraction, noted by both Eleanor and herself, was a loose thread in the fabric of the case, and Miss Marple was not one to leave threads dangling. The surgery was a modest building, its red-brick facade softened by a climbing rose, now leafless, but still clinging to the walls. Dr. Lloyd was just finishing with a patient when Miss Marple arrived, and he greeted her with a weary smile, his youthful face marked by shadows under his eyes. "Miss Marple," he said, ushering her into the small consulting room, "I didn't expect to see you here. Is it about the Colonel?" Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her side, her demeanor as unassuming as ever. "In a way, Dr. Lloyd, I've been thinking about that dreadful evening at Willoughby Hall. You were so quick to act when the Colonel collapsed, yet it must have been a terrible shock. I couldn't help but notice you seemed preoccupied before it happened." Lloyd's hands, resting on the desk, tensed slightly, and he leaned back, his expression guarded. "Preoccupied? I suppose I was. It was a busy day, Patience, house calls." And the Colonel's gatherings always had a certain tension. He could be demanding, you know. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft but piercing. Oh, I can imagine. He was so particular about his biscuits, wasn't he? Always choosing the crispest one. It's such a small thing, yet everyone seemed to know it. Did you ever notice how the tray was handled that night? Lloyd's gaze flickered to the window, where the fading light cast long shadows. The tray? I don't recall much about it. I passed it once. I think to be polite. Everyone did. Mrs. Finch brought it out, and Eleanor was fussing over the table settings. Crane was hovering, as usual. I was distracted, as you say. Miss Marple's needles, had they been in her hands, would have clicked softly. Distracted, she repeated, her voice gentle. It's curious, isn't it, how our minds can wander at such moments? I once knew a young man in my village, a chemist's assistant, who was so distracted by a personal matter that he nearly mixed the wrong prescription. Happily, no harm was done. But you, Dr. Lloyd, you were looking out the window, weren't you? As if expecting someone. Lloyd's face paled slightly, and he adjusted his cuffs, a nervous gesture that did not escape her notice. Expecting someone? No, not at all. I was just tired, I suppose. The Colonel's death was a shock. Cyanide acts so quickly, there was nothing I could do. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of quiet sympathy. Of course, you did all you could, but it must weigh on you, being so close to the Colonel. I understand you saw him often, not just as a doctor, but as a friend of the family. Did he ever mention any troubles? Enemies, perhaps? Lloyd hesitated, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. Enemies? Not exactly. He could be brusque clashed with people over money, investments, that sort of thing. Mr. Reed, his solicitor, had some disagreements with him recently, something about a risky venture the Colonel insisted on. And Mrs. Finch. Well, she was always grumbling about wages, but nothing that would lead to this. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on his face, noting the faint flush that crept into his cheeks when he mentioned Reed. There was something there. She thought a connection, perhaps, or a fear of saying too much. And Miss Eleanor? She asked, her tone as mild as the afternoon light. She must have relied on you, living so closely with the Colonel. Lloyd's expression tightened, and he looked away. Eleanor? She's capable. She didn't need my help. We spoke sometimes about the village, the hall. Nothing more. Miss Marple smiled, her mind drifting to a young couple she'd known years ago, whose stolen glances had betrayed a deeper bond than they admitted. Dr. Lloyd's unease, his quick dismissal of Eleanor, suggested more than a casual acquaintance. Had there been something between them? A shared secret, perhaps, that tied them to the Colonel's death. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple paused at the door. One last thing, Dr. Lloyd. You were so attentive when the Colonel collapsed, yet you seemed almost expectant, as if you knew something was amiss. It's such a small thing, but I've found small things often matter. Lloyd's eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw a flicker of panic. Expectant? No, Miss Marple, you're mistaken. I was shocked, like everyone else. I wish I could have saved him. Miss Marple thanked him and stepped into the chilly evening, her thoughts as intricate as the patterns in her knitting. Dr. Lloyd's distraction was no mere fatigue. It was rooted in something deeper, something personal. His mention of Reed's disagreements with the Colonel was a new thread, one that suggested financial motives beyond Eleanor's inheritance or Crane's debt, and his reluctance to speak of Eleanor hinted at a connection that might prove significant. As she walked back to Mrs. Bantry's cottage, the village settling into the quiet of dusk, Miss Marple considered the web of relationships at Willoughby Hall. Dr. Lloyd's distraction, Eleanor's ambition, Crane's debts, Mrs. Finch's resentment, Reed's nervousness, all were strands in a tapestry that concealed a murderer. The poisoned biscuit had been no accident, but a calculated act exploiting the Colonel's predictable habit. Yet the murderer had not accounted for her, and Miss Marple was determined to find the flaw in their design. The stars were beginning to prick the sky as she reached the cottage, her mind as clear as the frost underfoot. Tomorrow she would seek out Mr. Reed. His nervous tics and his role as the Colonel's solicitor made him a figure of interest, and Miss Marple had a way of coaxing truths from even the most reluctant tongues. The murderer, she thought, had been clever, but cleverness always left a trace, a word, a glance, a moment's hesitation that would lead her to the truth. Chapter 7. The Solicitor's Fear. The morning air in Chipping Norton carried a bite, the frost lingering on the cobblestones as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the modest office of Mr. Thomas Reed, the Colonel's solicitor. The village was hushed, save for the occasional clatter of a milk cart or the distant bark of a dog, but the quiet only sharpened Miss Marple's focus. Her conversation with Dr. Lloyd had left her with a sense of unease. His guarded manner and fleeting mention of Reed's financial disputes with the Colonel, suggesting another piece in the intricate puzzle of the poisoned biscuit. Mr. Reed, with his nervous tics and proximity to the Colonel's affairs, was a figure she could not ignore. The solicitor's office was tucked above the village bakery, its narrow staircase smelling faintly of warm bread and ink. Miss Marple climbed the steps with care, her shawl neatly pinned, her knitting bag a familiar weight at her side. The office itself was a clutter of papers and ledgers, the air heavy with the musty scent of old documents. Mr. Reed, a slight man with thinning hair and spectacles that perpetually slid down his nose, looked up from his desk, his expression one of startled apprehension. "Miss Marple," he said, rising hastily and nearly knocking over a stack of files. "This is unexpected. I assume you're here about poor Colonel Ashby?" Miss Marple smiled, her demeanor as gentle as the morning light filtering through the grimy window. "Indeed, Mr. Reed. I hope I'm not intruding. I've been reflecting on the sad events at Willoughby Hall, and as you were so close to the Colonel's affairs, I thought you might shed some light on the matter." Reed adjusted his spectacles, a gesture Miss Marple noted as a reflex of unease. "Light? I'm not sure what I can offer. The police inspector Grayson, that is, have already questioned me. It's a dreadful business, that poisoned biscuit. I can scarcely believe it." Miss Marple settled into a creaking chair, her eyes soft but unyielding. "Dreadful, yes, and so precise, don't you think? A single biscuit, laced with cyanide, chosen by the Colonel because of his well-known preference for the crispest one. It suggests someone who knew him well. As his solicitor, you must have known his habits, his relationships." Reed's fingers twitched, and he pushed his spectacles up again. "I suppose I did. He was particular, the Colonel, about his manuscripts, his investments, his biscuits. But I was just his solicitor, Miss Marple. I handled his will, his accounts, nothing more." Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "And his will, I understand, leaves the bulk of his estate to Miss Eleanor. That must have been a responsibility, managing such matters. Were there ever disagreements?" Dr. Lloyd mentioned something about investments, a risky venture the Colonel favored. Reed's face paled, and he busied himself with straightening a pile of papers. "Disagreements? Well, yes, occasionally. The Colonel was stubborn-liked to take risks with his money. There was a mining venture in South America, highly speculative. I advised against it, but he insisted. It caused some tension, but nothing serious." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on his hands, which trembled slightly as he spoke. "Tension can be so wearing, can't it? And that evening at the hall, you were near the biscuit tray, weren't you? I seem to recall you moving it aside to make room for your papers." Reed's spectacles slipped again, and he caught them with a jerky motion. "The tray? Yes. I suppose I did nudge it. It was in the way. You see, cluttering the table. I didn't touch the biscuits, if that's what you're implying. I had no reason to harm the Colonel." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone placating. "It's just that small details can be so telling. I once knew a clerk in my village, a nervous sort like yourself, who misplaced a document and caused quite a stir. It wasn't his fault, but his anxiety gave the wrong impression. You seem anxious, Mr. Reed. Is there something troubling you? Reed's eyes darted to the door, as if expecting an interruption. Troubling me? Only the Colonel's death, and all this talk of poison. It's unsettling, Miss Marple. I'm a simple man, not used to such things. Miss Marple nodded, her mind drifting to a memory of a timid shopkeeper she'd known, whose fear of discovery had led him to confess a minor theft. Reed's nervousness, she thought, was more than shock. It was the fear of a man with something to hide. But was it murder, or something less sinister, a financial misstep, perhaps tied to the Colonel's risky ventures? As she pressed gently, asking about the Colonel's relationships with the others at the party, Reed grew more evasive. Mrs. Finch was always complaining, he said. Thought the Colonel underpaid her. And Crane, well, there was bad blood there, over money owed for that manuscript. As for Eleanor, she and the Colonel argued sometimes, but that's family, isn't it? And Dr. Lloyd? Miss Marple asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He seemed so distracted that night. Did you notice anything between him and Eleanor? Reed hesitated, his fingers twisting a pen. Between them? I don't know. They spoke sometimes, but I didn't pay attention. I was busy with my papers, you see. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. Reed's hesitation, his avoidance of Dr. Lloyd's name, echoed Eleanor's own reticence. There was a connection there. She was certain, a thread that tied the doctor and the niece to the heart of the mystery. But Reed's fear suggested he knew more than he was saying, perhaps about the Colonel's finances or something more personal. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple paused at the door, her eyes catching a faded photograph on the desk. Reed, younger, standing beside a stern-faced woman who resembled Mrs. Finch. A sister, perhaps, or a deeper tie to Willoughby Hall. She filed the detail away, her mind as sharp as the pins in her knitting bag. Thank you, Mr. Reed, she said. You've been most helpful. It's remarkable how the smallest things, a glance, a word, can reveal so much. Reed's smile was strained as he showed her out, and Miss Marple stepped into the chilly morning, her thoughts weaving a pattern from the strands she'd gathered. Reed's fear, Lloyd's distraction, Eleanor's ambition, Crane's debts, Finch's resentment, all circled the poisoned biscuit, a weapon chosen with chilling precision. The murderer had known the Colonel's habits, but they had not anticipated her quiet persistence. As she walked toward Mrs. Bantry's cottage, the village stirring around her, Miss Marple resolved to unravel the final threads, certain that the truth lay just beyond the next conversation. Chapter 8. The Unraveling Thread. The evening settled over Chipping Norton with a quiet that seemed to hold its breath, the village houses glowing softly under the weight of an early frost. Inside Mrs. Clara Bantry's cottage, the fire cast a warm flicker across the parlor, where Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual chair, her knitting needles moving with a rhythm as steady as her thoughts. The events of the past day's conversations with Mrs. Finch, Victor Crane, Eleanor Price, Dr. Lloyd, and Mr. Reed had woven a complex tapestry in her mind, each thread a clue to the murder of Colonel Ashby. The poisoned biscuit, laced with cyanide and chosen for its crispness, had been no accident but a calculated act, and Miss Marple was now certain she held the pattern that would reveal the killer. Mrs. Bantry, perched on the edge of an armchair, was brimming with impatience. "Jane, you've been so quiet since you came back from Reed's office," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. "Have you worked it out? Who poisoned that dreadful biscuit? I'm sure it's Eleanor. She's got the hall now, hasn't she? Or perhaps Crane, with his slippery ways." Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked up, her eyes bright with the clarity of understanding. "It's curious, Clara, how people reveal themselves in the smallest ways. A glance, a hesitation, a word too carefully chosen. The Colonel's death was planned with such precision, relying on his love for a crisp ginger biscuit, but the plan was not flawless. No plan ever is. She set her knitting aside and leaned forward, her voice soft but deliberate. Let us consider the facts. The biscuit was poisoned with cyanide, a single dose in a single biscuit, placed on a tray that passed through many hands. Mrs. Finch baked the biscuits and left them unattended for a moment. Mr. Crane was in the kitchen, as was Miss Eleanor. Dr. Lloyd and Mr. Reed both handled the tray during the party. Each had opportunity, but motive is where the truth lies. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. Go on, Jane. You've got that look you know something. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I've been thinking about Dr. Lloyd's distraction that night and Eleanor's coolness when questioned. There was a moment at the party, Clara, a small thing I noticed but didn't fully grasp until today. Dr. Lloyd was watching Eleanor, not with suspicion, but with concern. And Eleanor, when she spoke of him, was too quick to dismiss their connection. Then there was Mr. Reed's mention of their conversations, and a photograph I saw, a younger Eleanor with the Colonel, her expression strained. It reminded me of a girl in my village, whose devotion to a man led her to a desperate act. Mrs. Bantry gasped. You think Eleanor and Dr. Lloyd were in it together? Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the fire, her thoughts as precise as the stitches in her knitting. Eleanor stood to inherit Willoughby Hall, but she was impatient, resentful of the Colonel's control. Dr. Lloyd, I suspect, is in love with her. A young man, ambitious, but tethered to a village practice, seeing in Eleanor a way to a grander life. Together, they had motive and opportunity. Eleanor was in the kitchen when Mrs. Finch stepped away. She could have slipped the poisoned biscuit onto the tray, knowing her uncle's habit would ensure he took it. Dr. Lloyd, aware of the plan, was distracted, watching for the moment it would unfold. But the cyanide, Mrs. Bantry said, leaning forward. Where would they get it? A doctor has access to such things, Miss Marple replied. Not directly, perhaps, but through connections, a chemist, a laboratory. And Eleanor, living at the Hall, would know the Colonel's habits intimately. The biscuit was no random choice. It was a weapon tailored to its victim. Miss Marple rose and crossed to the window, her silhouette small against the darkened glass. I spoke to Inspector Grayson this afternoon and shared my thoughts. He agreed to gather the suspects at Willoughby Hall tonight to test my theory. People, Clara, are predictable in their weaknesses, and guilt has a way of betraying itself. The gathering at Willoughby Hall was a tense affair, the drawing room lit by the same fire that had burned on the night of the murder. Inspector Grayson stood by the mantel, his presence solid and reassuring, while the suspects Mrs. Finch, Victor Crane, Eleanor Price, Dr. Lloyd, and Mr. Reed sat in uneasy silence. Miss Marple, unobtrusive in a corner, watched their faces, her eyes catching every flicker of emotion. Grayson began with the facts: the poisoned biscuit, the cyanide, the Colonel's predictable habit. Then he turned to Eleanor. Miss Price, you were in the kitchen before the party, adjusting the table settings. Mrs. Finch was absent for a moment. Did you touch the biscuits? Eleanor's face was pale but composed. I've told you, I didn't. I was arranging napkins, nothing more. Miss Marple spoke then, her voice gentle but piercing. And yet, Miss Price, you knew your uncle's habits so well. You knew he'd choose the crispest biscuit. And Dr. Lloyd, your concern for him that night was evident. I saw you exchange a glance, a moment of understanding. Dr. Lloyd's face flushed, and he opened his mouth to protest, but Eleanor's composure cracked. Enough! She cried, her voice sharp. Yes, I did it. I poisoned the biscuit. I was tired of his control, his endless demands. I wanted the Hall, my freedom. Henry Dr. Lloyd helped me get the cyanide, but he didn't know I'd use it. He thought I was only planning. The room fell silent, the weight of her confession settling like dust. Dr. Lloyd's head dropped into his hands, his shoulders shaking. Grayson nodded to his constable, who stepped forward to escort Eleanor from the room. Lloyd, broken, followed, admitting his role in procuring the poison under her influence. As the others dispersed, Miss Marple remained, her knitting resumed, her needles clicking softly. Mrs. Bantry, who had insisted on attending, whispered, "Jane, you're a marvel. How did you know?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled in the firelight. "People, Clara, are so like my knitting. A single drop stitch can unravel the whole pattern." Eleanor and Lloyd thought they were clever, but their glances, their hesitations, gave them away. And the biscuit, such a simple thing, yet it told the whole story. As they left the hall, the night was clear, the stars sharp above Chipping Norton. Miss Marple walked beside Mrs. Bantry, her mind already turning to the next skein of wool, the next pattern to unravel. The murderer had been found, but human nature, she knew, would always provide another mystery.